do I walk away feeling higher level of energy and inspired, or do I feel drained? It's very binary. Most of our investors admitted that, they only funded it because it was Eric. And if anybody was going to do a crazy thing, there's crazy people. I didn't think this was possible. I still backed you. Build a community in which you deposit value first. And we do that collectively together for a period of time before you ask. And I think about who are the people I want to work with 10 years from today. I think I'm really close to investing in somebody who tried to recruit me as their CTO 12 years ago. If you're guided by some very simple founding principles over the long run, I think things are going to work out okay.
A builder who spent 20 years depositing values into networks, ecosystems, institutions, and now is playing the fifth quarter, depositing investments guided by the same principles and philosophy that made him trustworthy and successful in the first place. We're talking with Tihomir Bajić, GP of Fifth Quarter Ventures. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So, Tiho, you grew up in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and you moved to Canada. After Canada, you moved to San Francisco. You became quite successful in your business endeavors. You had the pleasure of working with some of the, interesting minds in the world of, software development and entrepreneurship. Can you tell me, how was that experience? It seems kind of intentional.
Yeah. I always like to say that I was lucky to be the right time, right place. Maybe it's not lucky to be born during the times of, or grow up during the times of war, but through moving a lot, you end up meeting a lot of people, and you realize how important it is to build a network of people you can trust. And so, as a kid of 9 years old, when the civil war in Croatia started, I got to experience that very directly and at a young age, which I think was very formative as my life experience. And as we end up moving, it always ended up being a select group of people or a small group of people who end up helping you or guiding you or directing you without seemingly expecting anything back in return. And so the concept of pay forward was also instilled in me when I was a teenager. And when I was 17, almost 18, when I moved to Toronto, people who were friends of friends ended up, in a way, sponsoring me, giving me money to buy my first computer, ended up guiding me. Again, it was like a very selfless, paid forward community endeavor, which I felt that it was because there was already established trust. It took me years, later, until I started formalizing that in this language and being intentional about it. So for the first part of my life and for the first part of my career, I was a recipient of it. And then at some point, I kind of woke up and I realized that I could also actually create value for others, not just extract value, not just be a lucky recipient. And so for the last 10, 15 years, I've been doing that very intentionally. When you are guided by that principle of working around people who create trust, people who create communities around them, and you resonate on the same frequency, you will naturally end up finding a way to work with each other. So I was very blessed, when I was, 25, to start my first startup with people who were at that time probably the best startup entrepreneurs in Toronto.
That's very interesting. Can you mention their names?
Yeah, sure.
You also ended up having some amazing experiences as a builder and entrepreneur yourself with $100 million plus exits. That's quite an interesting journey.
Yeah. So again, I think you have to earn your own luck, and you have to be the right time, right place, and you have to recognize when an opportunity presents itself, so to speak, a door opens, and then you need to be conscious of recognizing that door is opening, and you have to consciously walk through it. Many people are presented, God gives us plenty of opportunities every single day, and we get to decide, due to free will, what we want to do.
How do you recognize that door, Tiho?
Takes time. Takes time, takes practice. I was always guided by, fundamentally, in the beginning it was a bit maybe complicated, but the older I get, the simpler it is. Fundamentally, it just starts with a single metric. If I spend time with that person through an interaction, exchange, meeting, project together, do I walk away feeling higher level of energy and inspired? Do I want to work with that person again, or do I feel drained? It's very binary. Usually, it's you like when you're working with somebody, you're never like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Usually, like, I want to work with Maya again, or God forbid that Maya is ever again on my project. Yes. And like, if Maya happens to be that person that I had a really positive relationship, but not just relationship, but like a feeling, like a reward, intrinsic reward, then I will naturally gravitate. And I always ask myself after interacting with people, I always reflect after meetings at the end of the day, how did that make me feel? And I then just am fortunate enough in my career that I can actually surround myself with enough people who predominantly make me feel really good and make me feel energized about what I'm doing and what we're doing together. And so I started my career when I was fairly young. Like when I joined my first startup when I was 22. These days that doesn't sound that young, but back in the day that was like very, very young. I was still at university. And so for the following several years, I was actually 21. I ended up working hard, finishing my degree and finishing my startup and working at a startup. And then in 2007, after I got married, an opportunity presented itself to join a couple of people who were already really, really successful. You asked for names. So David Stein and Daniel DeBow, they recruited another guy who was straight out of MBA, JD degree at University of Toronto, George Babu. And so the three of them plus me, we started a company, which was called Rypple, which, several years later was 4 years later was acquired by Salesforce. But the whole principle in my joining them wasn't, hey, we're going to make it big, I'm going to, become rich or anything like that. It was these people created the fastest growing, in the previous company where we met, they created the fastest growing software company in Canada. They're doing it again. I really like working with them. I can learn a lot from them. I just want to be part of that journey. It was never about, being acquired by a large company or anything like that. It was about working with people I can learn from, maximizing potential impact we can have if I work with them, and vice versa. What I receive from them is an opportunity, learning, and impact.
Yeah, it sounds like incredible journey. And you mentioned a few times some names who show you the ways of entrepreneurship and building in the way that you look up to.
Sure.
Who are those people? Because it really seems to me that you were seeking to be mentored by a specific type of people.
Absolutely, yeah. So when I started my career, I ended up working at a startup. I actually didn't even know it was called a startup or that was the concept of a startup. I just literally got a job and worked really, really hard. And then somebody later told me, oh, you were early startup employee. I'm like, oh, okay, great. And then later on, oh, you're a co-founder. I'm like, I don't know what that means, but it's a really powerful word. I like it. Again, it was more about what am I going to learn, who am I going to surround myself with, and what's the impact I'm going to have. I look through it through that prism. It was my first day on the job when we started the company, and I ended up, going to a local version of Best Buy and buying a bunch of computers and a bunch of network equipment. I ended up setting up, it was still back in the day where you had like office network and desktop computers and all of that. I ended up setting it all up. I ended up feeling really, really proud of myself, right? And I told Daniel, kind of like, hey, look what I did. And then he looked at me and he said, like, what do you want to be? Do you want to be an employer or do you want to be a founder? I'm like, well, what kind of question is that? I'm here on day one. Of course, I want to be a founder. And then he told me this thing that I always like to tell usually people during the interview. when I interview them or when they join one of my startups, which is kind of like a pyramid, right?
Yeah.
Of being impactful at a startup. Most people, they just do the job that they're told to do. They're usually are not aware of problems, or if they are aware of problems, they keep them to themselves. Like the second level of people, they see the problem, they discuss it, they share it with the manager, their colleagues, they think through ways it could be done. A level above that is, they volunteer to solve the problem and they have certain solutions. And then the level even above that is the founder level, where like you have nobody else. Like you realize there's a problem, you figure out a solution, or you attempt multiple ways of solving it, and then you solve it. And that's it. You move on to the next thing.
Yeah, the founder is actually the chief problem solver every day, every single time.
And so Daniel told me, like, hey, if that's what you want to be, what you did today is I asked you to, go figure out the network, and you end up doing it. And you feel really proud because you did the job that somebody told you to do. But next time you need to figure out if that's actually the problem you need to be solving. Or maybe you hire somebody to do the office network, or maybe the office network isn't even important. You have to go figure that stuff yourself. And fundamentally, like the more successful you are as an employee of a startup, or as somebody who is at a startup, the more problems you end up solving without necessarily telling people about it, without necessarily creating side effects and other people who have to clean up the mess around you. And so that was one of my core entrepreneurship lessons. I've written about it, I've talked about it, and it's like, I think he learned it from his CEO as well prior to that. And so I always like to pass it along, which is like, hey, if you need to understand that if you're at a startup, your main job, whatever your title says, whatever the job description says, that's important. But what's really important is that you end up acting like a founder. And what does a founder do? It just like solves problems every single day.
Yes. I said yes, because I've been through it so many times. I had a very interesting experience at Infobip. Back in the days in 2012, 11, when I started working with them. They were acting like a 300 people startup. Okay, right. So I was hired as a marketing manager. Everybody in marketing they were marketing managers. They had a completely flat structure. And I was like, okay, what is my job? Like, I don't know. Figure it out. So I was looking for opportunities and problems to solve. And I think everybody that came into Infobip at that stage were actually quite an entrepreneurial mindset, because the ones that stayed found problems to solve, and the ones that didn't kind of moved.
Yeah, and it's not for everybody, and everybody goes through different periods in their life and their career. And one of the interesting things about entrepreneurship is it's a contact sport.
Yes.
It's like one thing to read about it and observe it on TV. It's another thing to practice it. It's like reading about boxing and actually sparring with a partner, right? And so it's a contact sport, and you got to practice it. The best for me is like when there's like a professor at university teaching entrepreneurship, and the last time they were at the startup was like 20 years ago.
Yes,
it's always like it's not the way to do it. I mean, people ask me about lessons or what to do, and when I'm just like, just do it, and then reflect and keep doing it, because it's one of those things that you really learn by doing.
And you kept doing it, and you spent quite a bit of time at Long-Term Stock Exchange.
That's right.
So working alongside Eric Ries. How did you guys met, and what really attracted you to the project? Yeah,
so Eric and I met when he was, at the time, this was before he published the Lean Startup book. He had a blog called Startup Lessons Learned. And he was really proselytizing this lean startup method. And there were several people in Silicon Valley, like Steve Cook and like several Steve Blank, and several others who were kind of laying out the foundation for it. And we ended up reaching out. This is one of those things that entrepreneurs do. You find somebody online who is saying something smart that you want to learn from. You just write them an email or send them a direct message, and you end up connecting. It's like, well, how do you meet these people? I literally just emailed, or I just called, or I showed up. In Eric's case, I showed up at a lecture and said, I I waited patiently, and I introduced myself, and we ended up meeting each other. He ended up being an advisor consultant. I tried to recruit him. He's like, I'm writing this book. I think it's going to be really big.
So wait, you tried to recruit?
Yeah, I tried to recruit. Yeah.
Okay.
I gave him a job offer and everything. He was very humble about it. And he's like, oh, thank you so much, but I think I'm going to focus on my book. I was like, look, Eric, there's not that many people who make money off of books, especially managerial books. Here's the job, just in case this stuff doesn't work out. I guess he never forgot that kindness. And then several years after, it still is the number 1 or number 2 best-selling kind of managerial book for startups. Even 10 years, more than 10 years later, 15 years later, we ended up reconnecting. He ended up telling me about this idea that he stumbled upon as he was doing the research for his book. This idea of the long-term stock exchange, or this idea that the public markets reward different behavior than the startups in the private markets are rewarded for. And that when people, when founders take companies public, they are subject to these perverse incentives. And quite often the thing that made a startup really successful as a private company, no longer holds or cannot be practiced the same way as they are a public company. And so the idea was, how do you go and create a system of incentives and protections and governance that enables the best startups to actually, thrive in the public markets and in the long run, as opposed to, the public markets being increasingly short-term focused, quarterly meet or beat expectations.
When was that?
So the book was published 2011.
It was 11, yeah 11, 12.
And we started working on it in 2015.
That philosophy and the conclusion that Eric made and you guys discussed in 2011, actually, it's quite visible when you look at the startups and understand, in the past 3 or 4 years, how many of them went public. So there's, and at what time, how big are they before they go public? There's a lot of startups that are, achieving billions of revenue nowadays. They're not going public.
That's right.
For those
reasons.
Those reasons specifically.
Yeah. So the mission of long-term stock exchange is to create basically a safe harbor, a trusted place, a trusted community for startups to operate or, to grow up and then eventually go public and operate successfully in the long run as publicly traded companies. And of course, being a publicly traded company has all these other benefits of access to capital, brand recognition, and fundamentally retail investors can participate in the value creation. So those are all the reasons why I was really attracted to work on this idea. It's a huge idea. At the time when we started doing it, the most recent exchange or the most recent exchange that listed companies was NASDAQ 40 years earlier. So it was like, okay, this happens maybe once in a generation. And I felt like it was a generational challenge, and it just spoke to me, having previously worked at startups that went public or were acquired by publicly traded companies. I had firsthand experience of what happens to innovation, what happens to incentives, how middle management becomes misaligned in these companies that grow up really fast and then they go public. And I felt like there was a lot of value being left on the table. And having studied math, economics, and all these things, I was like, okay, there's clearly a better way. And so we tried building a whole new stock exchange that basically lists companies on their different principles.
So you saw a major issue in the ways and principles that are guiding basically the entire U.S. or the world economy.
The world economy, yeah.
And you said, okay, the pressure point, the lever that we can pull and maybe make the biggest change ever is to create a third ever exchange.
Listing exchange. That's right.
And that's a massive endeavor.
Oh, absolutely. I think most of our investors who gave us money, and they even admitted to that after we got our license, after we listed companies, some of them admitted that, they only funded it because it was Eric. And if anybody was going to do a crazy thing, it could have been the group that Eric put together.
Those crazy people.
I'm not going to name names, but literally people, like some of our lead investors were like, I didn't think this was possible. I still backed you because if anybody was going to do it, And so we succeeded in actually building an exchange, taking companies public. Still a long way to go and really change how quarterly capitalism drives Wall Street.
And then in 2016, you founded Serbian Entrepreneurs. It's an apolitical, invitation-only, paid-forward community. So it's not a network; it's a community that you need to deposit value into, right? Can you explain that evolution? What happened in your head when you were thinking about, oh, I really need to create this, or did it, and this is what I want to do? Where is that drive coming from? Where is the need to do something like that coming from?
Well, one of there's multiple factors that contributed. One of the things that I usually don't talk that much publicly about, but absolutely was core and central to it, is when I moved to San Francisco. For the second time in my life, I ended up moving to a different country altogether. And having to start from scratch. I didn't know absolutely anybody except the guy who helped me open up the office. And, having already immigrated to Toronto previously, I kind of short-circuited the whole process. And I said, I just need to build my community, right? And so the initial community, because I was an engineer, I was a software engineer, CTO, the initial community I ended up building was heads of engineering departments, CTOs at other startups. And, that led me also in software development. There's such a thing, there's obviously all these startups that raise money, or public companies that operate really large budgets. But then there's also this kind of, at the time, and it has grown since, niche community of open source software.
Yeah.
Right? And having grown up where I grew up, always felt like, somebody who had to do a slightly different path than the majority. It just kind of spoke to me, the open source community. Ended up being involved in a number of open source projects. I ended up working on a number of standards, formats, like the PDF format, like things that end up becoming W3C or other world standards that end up being partially or completely open sourced. I ended up running hundreds of open source meetups. I ended up putting more than 10 open source conferences. And so, that is where, moving from Toronto to San Francisco, I spent intentionally time for several years building a community in, what even at the time was still kind of like a niche thing, like open source software. Now it's becoming bigger and bigger. And there's a lot of startups that actually are formed around open source software, but it was fairly early on, and I saw some wonderful companies, like, for example, Databricks, come out of that, those communities, right? And so that was one thing that guided me. The other thing that guided me was, after I left my hometown at 9, I ended up being kind of like moving around quite a lot, a journeyman, if you will, and ended up working with entrepreneurs from around the world. Because I myself always felt like an immigrant. I always felt like somebody who was not the first-class citizen.
That feels like a very strong internal drive.
Absolutely, yeah.
If you feel you don't belong, is that a feeling of not belonging?
It's not a feeling of not belonging. It's more of a feeling of, I know this was not my place by birth, and I kind of partially have to earn my right, and partially, like, I'm not as privileged as the people who were there by birth or by other virtue, right? And so that naturally ended up in San Francisco. Both Toronto and San Francisco are super metropolitan. Mm-hmm. And most entrepreneurs in those two cities are actually immigrants, right? And so that ended up kind of actually being my group of people. So I ended up really networking in various expat communities, and I ended up during my time in San Francisco, I ended up running engineering teams in 10 different countries remotely. And so I learned about those countries and about their culture.
Way of work.
And the way they work, right? And then, I was their kind of safe harbor, a person who, literally some of them would sleep on my couch, but
interesting.
Yeah.
How did that end up being, like someone sleeping on your couch?
You started people, right? Like before there was Airbnb, there was couch surfing, right?
True.
And so
I remember those days, actually. Yeah.
Entrepreneurs come to San Francisco. It's an expensive city, and end up crashing with me or crashing in my office. My office was also an apartment. Yeah. And so, I'll connect with a lot of entrepreneurs from around the world. And so the more I connected with them, the more I was invited to these expat communities for entrepreneurs. And I realized that Serbian people don't have an expat entrepreneurial community.
Mm.
And so between open source software, between this lack of expat community for Serbian entrepreneurs, and really wanting to, increasingly I started part-time and then I turned full-time my efforts on long-term stock exchange, which itself was a community of founders.
Yeah.
Right? Like we ended up going through Techstars, we ended up going through YC, we ended up working with the back offices for Techstars YC, 500 startups, to build their own communities and software and whatnot. So it was like kind of like turtles all the way down. It was like community for other people who do communities in startups, right? And so those three things were there. And then after my second son was born, I ended up taking, for the first time in a long, long time, a couple of weeks off. And I remember basically walking Costa, like pushing the stroller down the street, or the bassinet, I guess, when he was a newborn. And just like a beautiful sunny day, and I look at him and my 2-year-old who I'm dragging by the hand, and I'm thinking like kind of like, what is the world that I'm building? Like, what is the world that they're going to inherit? And that was like the turning point in my head, where I felt like, okay, I work in all these expat communities, I work in all these entrepreneurial communities, I know how to put together open source communities. Like, it felt as if all my life experience, professional experience, has been guiding me towards, okay, I should really be a community builder. And so I started Serbian Entrepreneurs, after my second son was born, again, to fulfill all these three kind of needs that I felt they need to be there, and ended up being a really great vehicle for me to practice entrepreneurship, community building, pay it forward, because, how do you go and build that community? Well, when you don't, when you only know a handful of other Serbian entrepreneurs, it's not that many of us actually, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So the first thing I did was, like I said, for the next year, every week I'm going to meet at least 2 Serbian entrepreneurs. So the first week, that's not hard. Second week, that's not hard. Third, fourth week, it becomes like, okay, so you have to really think about how the heck are you going to find new people to meet.
So you basically spend the first 6 months just building that?
Absolutely.
Or
I probably spent more than the first year. I probably interviewed over 100 people.
So when you said interviewed, it's like you're reaching out. How did that work? You're reaching out and then you speak to people and then you listen to that. So I guess not everybody deserved the spot in the Serbian
No, of course, yeah. I mean, it's like when you're a startup founder and you're building a product from scratch, you listen to your customers.
Yes.
So I end up doing customer interviews, 100 plus of them before I did a formal thing. And then through those 100 plus interviews, I end up selecting a group of 15 people who I felt the most resonated. And I invited them formally to be part of the launch of the, we called it at the time Serbian Entrepreneurship Club. I simplified it to Serbian Entrepreneurs afterwards. But that was like more than 10 years. That was 10 years ago now.
Did you already had the principles around which you want to build the Serbian Entrepreneurs, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So those 100 interviews or 100 plus helped me distill it down to really a single thing. I usually like to have 3 things, but you try to take away more and more and more until like really the essence is there. And the core principle was, apart from it being apolitical, areligious, all of these things, so it had to be neutral, right? The founding principle or the guiding principle was a paid forward network for Serbian entrepreneurs. That's it. Like, build a network, build a community in which you deposit value first, and we do that collectively together for a period of time before you ask. And then I screened that very quickly. If people were quid pro quo, now very much quid pro quo, in the first meeting or 2, like I would not invite them. I had coffees phone calls with everybody at least 2 or 3 or 4 times before I invited them. So I was very, very principle driven and very meticulous in the early days to make sure that in the end, it was also somewhat selfish. Like I wanted to surround myself with the people I felt I could learn from, right? And then, if they were really, really that great, I was also hoping that if I select first 15 people, that everybody in that group, when they show up, look at the other 14, 15 people and they're going to be like, wow, amazing. I get to spend time with these.
I think everything in our lives, professional lives as well, start as an act of selfish thing, like self-preservation. Sure. You want to put yourself, you wanted your entire career to put yourself in the company of, people that make you feel energized and,
Absolutely.
And then from that, you translate that energy into, giving back. And
yep.
It feels like that's how it is in Serbian entrepreneurship as well.
Mm-hmm.
When you look back 10 years, like 10 years ago, Serbia had 200 startups, maybe 300. By 224, the ecosystem had approximately around 900 startups and the value of 1.2 billion US dollars. So how does this make you feel? Serbian Entrepreneur started in 2016.
That's right.
And you work, quite sometimes on different projects. I would like to hear about those projects and your involvement in Serbia, building the Serbian startup ecosystem. Feels like Serbian entrepreneurs were crucial for building that flywheel for the ecosystem around here.
Yeah. I think, 10 years later, it's night and day difference. 10 years ago, we had some fundamental gaps in the ecosystem. You could point to things like various laws. You could point to things like, how do you raise money and transfer that money from abroad to Serbia? And that was actually really hard at the time. There was no accelerators. People were trying locally, but none of the world-class, people here, none of the world-class investors or Silicon Valley people were actually spending any time here. There was not that many VC funds at all that would be even visiting Belgrade, not alone having an office here. Just the number of people in startups as well, or as you said, the number of startups was actually quite small. And I think 2016, looking back, was a really essential year, 2016, 2017, because in those 2 years, a number of really key things happened. So there was a bunch of kind of guidance changed when it comes to banking rules and regulation. There was a bunch of improvements in how easily it was to actually set certain things in Serbia or get funding from abroad and transfer that to Serbia. In addition to Serbian Entrepreneurs, which started being really active in San Francisco, and then it spread around the world. Digital Serbia initiative, several other initiatives were started in 2016, 2017. We made it much easier to actually pay, remit money. There was like a bunch of these things which were really foundational to building the startup ecosystem. So I would say that Serbian Entrepreneur members were some of the actors, obviously not the only ones. There was a bunch of help from various state bodies or state-related firms. And then, as generally the IT industry kept growing, a subset of people who work in an IT industry end up forming their own startups. And so the whole thing just ended up working out a certain way, where now, 10 years later, I don't think we have there's a bunch of things that we could still improve, but I don't think that we have any key gaps anymore, right? It's more like we could improve things, but it's not like it's no longer possible to do certain things, right? You have, I think, at least 3 really great accelerators. You have more than 10 VCs that I know of that have somebody on the ground in Serbia, or they are domiciled in Serbia. Plus other VCs another 10, 15 end up visiting on a quarterly basis. So you can raise money, you can go to an accelerator, you can get world-class mentors. There's, multiple times per year flights being organized between here and New York or here in San Francisco. So it's for entrepreneurs, for founders. So I think it's night and day from how it was 10 years ago to what it is today. Still a long way to go, obviously. But I think right now we're kind of like we've caught up, I would say, with, when you relatively look at the rest of the Europe and the startup ecosystem. And I think we can really lean into some things that here in Serbia we have that some other people don't have. And so the kind of like, let's say that the next 10 years, we should be really focused on that.
Yeah, I want to unpack a little bit of that. But moving back to Serbian Entrepreneurs, and what was your focus at that time when Serbian Entrepreneurs were created? You were in San Francisco, right? And some of your core team or team members, community members, were from United States, maybe Canada. What was your idea initially? What did you want to achieve when you start, gathering these gatherings across the world? Like, was it the idea initially, like, okay, we really just want to support, you mentioned that, want to support Serbian entrepreneurs, but in which way?
Yeah, it was very organic, I would say, right? Again, the founding principle was, keep the ego and politics and everything at the door.
Was that hard?
Oh, very hard. Very hard. Like, for example, the first couple of years, people really found it, I guess, even offensive to have a community that's called Serbian Entrepreneurs. Why not Balkan Entrepreneurs? Why not XU Entrepreneurs? Why not Adriatic Entrepreneurs? Why all of these things? And I was like, look, you all bring up a really valid point, but I kind of started it, so I get to name it. If you don't like it, it's my thing, Like, I really fundamentally believe that, it's almost like, I don't know the exact number, but let's just say that just as many or maybe even more Serbs live outside of the borders of today's Serbia.
Yes, diaspora is bigger, louder than...
And
community.
And we're extremely unnetworked and extremely fragmented. And, before I solve broader issues, I could have called European entrepreneurs, right? I mean,
yes.
I'm part of Canadian entrepreneurs as well, but that has nothing to do with, right? Again, it's not exclusive necessarily in the sense of, you can only be here if, you pass a 23andMe test, or whatever. Like, that's silly. But it's like, I think the name should actually represent something. And I felt like, the diaspora was like incredibly fragmented. And having moved and lived in multiple cities in the diaspora, I felt like, okay, let's just have something that really clearly says something. And although I'm quite, I'm religious and I'm political in certain ways, but I always felt like, okay, I should check that at the door, and there should be, a open community for Serbian entrepreneurs and those who feel that way, who want to help each other out. Anyway, so there was no grand plan. It was like, okay, let's just start with people in San Francisco. What usually happens when you meticulously curate a community and you have several meetings, if things go well, people talk about it. And then the word of mouth spread, and then people started flying out from Serbia, from London, from New York to be at those meetings. They would change trips in order to be able to participate. And then, several people asked me independently of one another, hey, could I organize a similar meeting in New York? Hey, can I organize a similar meeting in London? And spread to 10 different cities. I was like, great, as long as you follow the same founding principle, like this is a thing that other people can practice as well. And then because it was very kind of like open and fairly networked and fairly controlled in the beginning in terms of like just the number of people present, end up talking about different things. I would always ask about, especially new people, what are you working on? What can we help you with? And then third, fourth, fifth meeting, something like that. There was like an entrepreneur from San Francisco that co-founded a startup with an entrepreneur from Novi Sad. They raised money in US and they were having some trouble with setting up the proper money transfer and all those things. And at one of the meetings, they said that we're really struggling with that. And I said, like, well, I know some people, let me call some people. And we ended up realizing that there was like some fundamental issues around how that is being regulated, number one. Number two, how banks treat it because of ultimate beneficiary ownership and AML rules. And so we ended up working with banks, we ended up working with the government, we ended up working with a bunch of people in order to kind of iron out those issues. And then that was like one of the first things that we worked on. And it was very organic because one of our members had that problem. And then people would, bring forth other issues that were challenging, they were struggling with. So we ended up doing a bunch of those kind of like bottom up, member driven, hey, somebody needs help with this, let's go figure that out. And so some of our members ended up building, massive companies, and they wanted to figure out like visa issues. They want to figure like all of these things that needed to then be worked out. And I don't ascribe that, and I don't keep a list of things, the Serbian entrepreneurs accomplished or did, because it's really the members who did it. This was just like a meeting place, a community where people can discuss those problems and solutions. And then I try never to take credit for it, because in the end, it's usually not me who ends up solving the issues. It's other people who end up doing that.
That's amazing. Is there a story that you're particularly fond of that, happened within that community, the problem that was particularly solved that we can share?
Yeah, I think two things that, especially in those early days, were essential, and I don't even know exactly how this came up, but somebody was on a trip, I believe, to Belgrade, and they were so used to doing the Apple Tap, Apple Pay, and they came back and they're like, that doesn't work in Serbia. And then several of us, what do you mean it doesn't work? And then we looked into it, and there was no Google Pay, and there was no Apple Pay. And then several of us were really motivated to go fix that. And then my co-founder, Brano, ended up knowing people at Apple, and we ended up organizing a bunch of meetings. We ended up contacting people in the National Bank of Serbia, government. It had to be like a three-way kind of situation. But ended up being solved. And I remember the next time I was going to Serbia, everybody was already using it. I was like, that felt really good just to see like, okay, that's the direct kind of.
Thank you, Tiho.
No, and it was a bunch of members from the community, right?
Thank you, community.
Yeah, I think Brano ended up running point in most of it. So really, I think single-handedly he ended up organizing people. But there was like a bunch of people who had to contribute, right? Because you had to have the contact. And then interestingly, this entrepreneur, investor who I really admire, Nina from Index, she's Armenian, and I used to. In those days, early days of Serbian Entrepreneurs, because she was already, let's say, ahead of us in organizing Armenian community, I would poll her again. See, like the community. I always felt like I have my Armenian brothers, I have my Greek brothers, it's just like, I have my Canadian brethren, I have my Aussies, right?
And sisters.
Yeah, exactly. I meant more kind of like Kazina, yeah, and anyway, so then it turned out that when we were doing that for Serbia, Armenian community did the same thing for Armenia, just like slightly ahead or before us. So I ended up calling her several times and be like, hey, how did you solve this problem? And she's like, oh, there's a person, Bob or whatever. I'm making up a name now, right? Just like, call Bob. He did this with us. End up like reaching out to Bob at Apple. Bob was like, oh, yeah, Armenia. Oh, you guys, okay. Well, this is the way you do it. Ends up cutting through. I don't even know how many meetings. We end up just like, oh yeah, this is how you solve it. And so again, it's that. I think if you really start, there are certain problems. Like I'm also a math major, right? And so I think about the category of problems in the world, and there are certain problems that require all-out, full-time effort by a number of people to be solved. There are certain problems that no matter how hard you work, are they unsolvable? And there are certain problems that just take time. And you can throw money at it, you can throw people at it, but it will just take some time for the solution to mature. And most people mistake not realizing what sort of a problem domain they're in, right? And so I really like solving the problems in that last kind of category that I mentioned, because you actually can build a business around it. It's really hard to build a business around something that's like a part-time effort for 5 years.
You call 5 years part-time effort.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Right? It's like part-time effort for like, a couple of hours a week for 5 years. But if you did, and maybe that's like, let's say 500 hours or 1,000 hours they're going to put into that project. But taking 1,000 hours and cramming it into half a year won't be the same result. Because if you ever, worked in an enterprise sales cycle or anything like that, it's just like scheduling meetings, follow-ups, just certain things take time, right? And so you can't have somebody full-time solving an Apple Pay issue for Serbia, because what the heck are they going to do in the meantime? But if you have several people who are really passionate about it, and every couple of weeks they do several hours worth of work, 6 months later, you solve the problem. Nobody was working on it full-time, but people cared about it, and they pushed the ball forward. And so I really like focusing my Serbian entrepreneurs' efforts around problems like that no one is actually going to go and solve, because they're not full-time problems for somebody to go and solve. They're not problems that somebody's going to build a business around, or somebody's really going to be directly benefiting from it. It's like kind of like a broader thing that takes patience and persistence. And so I like those problems.
But also, those are the fundamental problems in many of the cases. Like,
absolutely,
they have to be solved in order for you to build on the ecosystem on top of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a lesson from open source software, to bring it back there, right? Most people who end up contributing to open source software, they're not doing it full time. They're doing it part time, right? But once in a while, they gather, whether online in a Discord community or whether in person, and they have some fundamental key conversations to kind of advance the project forward. Again, you can't cram that, because everybody else has a job and everybody else is figuring stuff out. And sometimes you just need to have time pass for a new process, a new format, or a new piece of software to take hold, and for people to bake it, people to play with it and kind of come back with learnings or feedback. You just can't force that. It takes time. But it's not full time, so you can't just sit around. You have to do something else. And so, we're in these incredible multi-threaded processors. So I always make sure that a really big part of my compute, my personal effort, is being spent on times that on efforts, on tasks that nobody else would be looking at, and patience, persistence, small efforts, but consistently seen through, end up resulting in really big outcomes.
I'm very fascinated by open source community, by the way. I'm a big fan of Mark from, Canonical. He created Canonical 20 years ago, and he was all in. And, in 2026, Canonical is where it is, right? They needed this long-term vision and dedication and incremental work over 20 years to get where they are. And they never gave up. They were so passionate about it. And it feels like the passion is the key component of a successful community.
Absolutely.
And in your case as well, in the case of Serbian Entrepreneurs, you basically handpicked very passionate people aligned with your vision, that right now you or anyone doesn't have to, prod with the community and push the community to be active. It's just its own thing. It's its own living organism.
Yeah, I spend very little time consciously running it. Yeah. In different cities, there's people running it. And if they find it valuable and the community around them finds it valuable, I think that it's a good thing to have in place.
A couple of years ago, you moved to Serbia.
That's right.
It was from San Francisco, you moved to Serbia. Yeah. That was in 2024.
That's right.
Right.
A year and a half.
with your family, and you started Fifth Quarter Ventures as a GP. What have you seen in 2024 that made you think, okay, now is the time? Have you seen something and you felt something?
Well, the story behind Fifth Quarter Ventures started really when COVID hit. Because prior to that, I lived in San Francisco. All software entrepreneurs around the world wanted to eventually arrive in San Francisco for business, for capital raising, for talent, for whatever. Like that ended up being the central place, the epicenter of entrepreneurship, right? You just need to be there. And a lot of people were very exclusive about, like, if I fund you, you gotta have the employees in San Francisco or the general Bay Area. You have to do it this way. You have to. Then COVID hit, and I had already spent like a decade building distributed engineering teams, and I built a distributed engineering team for long-term stock exchange, and I was getting quite a bit of flack for that from our investors. But then when COVID hit and all the offices were shuttered in San Francisco for like a month, for 2 months, people were like, and then ended up being for much longer, people ended up calling me and then ask for input. And how do you set up this distributed engineering environment? How do you set up, how do you go from, these remote people? And so I ended up consulting a whole bunch. And I ended up recognizing this opportunity that for the first time ever, you could actually raise money from tier 1 VCs over Zoom. You didn't need to see them in person, like it was the case in 2019. In the fall of 2020, I helped a bunch of people raise money without ever actually being in Silicon Valley, or raise money from Silicon Valley without ever being in Silicon Valley. I was like, okay, so there's this opportunity. At the time, I was helping several Serbian entrepreneurs fundraise. I ended up meeting, and I was working with South Central Ventures as their scout. South Central Ventures was one of the first VCs, if not the first, kind of like properly set up VC that exclusively cared for this geography. And ended up meeting with one of their investment team members, Peja. And Peja and I ended up talking about kind of like what is the opportunity, what are we seeing on each side of the ocean. And then in 21, 22, we decided to kind of get together to start a first private VC fund in Serbia that would operate like a Silicon Valley VC fund, in the sense of, both Peja and I have startup experience, we have operator experience. We didn't want to be investors necessarily purely and just investors, but we want to be operating partners. We saw a big opportunity for founders from here and in our diaspora to basically help them operationally. And so that idea came in 22. We decided to actually incorporate and run the fund out of Serbia. So when we got the license in 23, we ended up doing our first close and standing the fund, making it operational in Q4 of 2023. And then as things started to kind of take place in 2024, ended up being both a personally good opportunity for my family, as well as for Fifth Quarter Ventures and a bunch of other reasons like that we relocated to Belgrade. So now for the first time ever, I live in Belgrade.
Welcome back.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And so, it's been a year and a half, and the fund's been operational now for just over 2.5 years.
This is interesting because a lot of founders feel like they have to leave Serbia.
That's right.
At some point. It's not just Serbia, it's Europe.
Correct, yeah.
Right? Is the goal of your community and the Fifth Quarter Ventures to help people leave more efficiently or stay?
I would say neither. I don't like thinking about it as leaving or coming back. I think about it as kind of an entrepreneurial journey. And especially prior to COVID, I think it was, San Francisco was the place where you wanted to spend some time and or actually live for a while and run your startup. I think it's still, I still think it's a special place, although now some of that pixie dust has been distributed around the world a bit more. So I do think that it's a really valid, there's a really valid business case to be made for entrepreneurs, especially from Europe. You know, spending time in the US, being close to the customer and or the investor and all of that. So I don't think about it as going and leaving. I think about it more as kind of being part of the global startup community and learning from the best. But there are also some advantages to being on the ground in Europe around, you know, access to talent, around distraction. The best entrepreneurs I know, they take advantage of being present in both ecosystems, and they balance it the right way.
And in some cases, in most of the cases, actually, it's making the product and the journey and the founders quite unique. They give them this unique perspective of the problem to solve. So it's very interesting that you have built a Serbian Entrepreneurs community based on specific pay-it-forward principles. Right. And it works on the philosophy that it works on. And now you're a VC. So how do you protect the pay-it-forward principles and the community at the same time, and the spirit of community, because you're so dedicated to it? Sure. I mean, it feels like it's a true part of yourself.
Yeah.
When your day job is, you know, now about selection,
sure,
and, you know, maybe faster exits.
Right.
There's another side of it, like VCs are after investing in a very interesting business that, you know, where you can see an exit coming in the next 10 up to 10 years. How do you balance all of that out?
Yeah, it's a great question. Those are two explicit hats that you mentioned, actually.
Yes.
There are multiple hats. Like I'm a CTO of a startup I'm incubating. I'm active as an investor in other countries as well. So like in my every day of my professional life is quite varied day to day, and I tend to wear multiple hats. In conversations with people, it's like I fairly quickly, you know, put people in a certain track, if you will. Right, and I say like, hey, you know, is this interesting to me as a fund, as Swift Quarter Ventures? This may be interesting to some of my partner funds, or is this entrepreneur, you know, along the journey where I should really just be helping them without you know, really. And I usually tell people, you know, most of my conversations these days is like me actually telling people why they should not raise.
Seriously.
Yeah.
That's very interesting, because I've seen a lot of bootstrap people bootstrap businesses, that really avoid dipping even their toes into VC for specific reasons. Can you tell me what is the case when you are saying to someone, don't do this?
Yeah, I think most people, especially here, are fundraising for the first time, right? And if they're fundraising for the first time, I first actually want to help them understand what sort of problem they're solving, and therefore who are their stakeholders and who they should align themselves with, and if they're taking capital, who they should take capital from. VCs happen to be a very particular type of capital that requires certain particular type of return and effort and all of that. But not every problem is solvable by VC capital, and not every founder actually wants to run a business. They may not know it, but running a VC-backed business, trust me, I've done it, is not the glorious thing that most people think. It's actually quite hard, because you're under constant pressure, and you're being pushed in certain ways that you never thought were possible. You know, that is good for some people, and it's really great for certain types of problems. But unless you're solving a really big problem and a solution and using a solution that can scale globally, taking VC money is usually a mistake. And so I really fundamentally try to help people understand whether or not they're solving something that is actually solvable by right? Because my being a VC is only a small part of where I could help out. Like I can help more broadly, and so helping people understand that, like, hey, when you're talking to me, it just doesn't mean that you have to figure out how to sell me on something, right?
Yeah, that's.
So it's actually quite easy, right? Like your question was about
Yes.
how do I?
I
It's
wanted
actually
to
quite
circle
easy
back.
because most people actually shouldn't be raising VC money, or they're not
Are
ready.
you shooting yourself in the foot?
No, not
that?
really. No, not really, because I played a long game, right? Most of the people I back, that happens months and months after we end up meeting and after we end up doing some work together.
Yeah, I was speaking to a couple of VCs. They always said to me, okay, we need to date first before we,
Sure.
because it's not just about, okay, is this founder a solid founder? Do we have a founder problem fit? Is this a solid problem? Blah, blah, blah. It's also about, do we understand each other? Like, are we going to be able to work together for years and years? And that's a specific kind of bond, I would say.
Absolutely. And are you compatible in the way you work?
Yeah.
Do they really understand what you need to see back as a return, as an output, as an outcome of you giving them money, right? Like those are all the things that, and a lot of times, because the size of the fund or the stage of the, investment, quite often, in my kind of VC profession, if you will, or my practicing being a VC, I come across a startup that I think is a great investment opportunity, just not for me, right? I usually then try to kind of give it to one of my partner funds or otherwise route them. And I have just, been doing this now for more than 10 years. It always comes back positive, right? Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not even next year. But on a daily basis, now I get emails of people who like, oh, you may not remember, but you helped me. And I truly don't. But you're like, hey, you helped out, or my co-founder found this really helpful. Thank you for doing that. And not everything is transactional, right? Like not everything is quid pro quo. A lot of people, if you end up helping them, they end up helping other people, and that's just fine.
But it's quite rewarding if you put yourself back into that spot when you were walking down San Francisco, pushing your baby, and would you say to yourself, okay, I chose good?
When I made that decision, I felt like it was just something I had to do. I didn't have KPIs. So I don't have an objective way of looking back and saying, hey, that was a good decision, or I did well, with all that time investment and all of that. Like I probably could have done better elsewhere. Most likely I would have done way better elsewhere. I just feel okay, with myself and with that decision. And so I think it's a lifestyle, and I live it every day. And so it's good.
Good. I have a few more questions. I want to dig a little bit into the companies that Fifth Quarter Ventures invested in. So building community before building revenue, something I see some of the most unique tech companies are doing. And you mentioned the open source community that I really, really admire, have been for a long time. Wasp did it. How did you make your bet? Did you make your bet on the technology, on the founder, on the community? Can you walk me through that decision making?
I first met the Wasp co-founders, their brothers from Zagreb. I first met them when they just graduated, or they were going through Y Combinator. So they were going through YC. And I ended up writing a small angel check. And then I end up following kind of their progress. And they're a really great example of like both open source and community building, and kind of like working in public and sharing their lessons learned. And I think that engendered them, like to endear them to a lot of people in that community. And I knew it was, and we had several meetups together. I ended up posting something about it. And then over the next couple of months, I ended up getting a number of unsolicited emails or people reaching out to me saying like, hey, I didn't know you were involved with that project, but just, I just wanted to say thanks because this is how I use it, or this is great because, or can you put me in touch with the founders because I really want to do this. And so I ended up realizing that it was like a really, under the covers, it was like a really vibrant community that they have built and a lot of believers that they have kind of created along the way. And so when there was an opportunity to invest into a larger round, we took that opportunity as Fifth Quarter Ventures. And that's a great example of, knowing somebody, I think at that point for 2 years before writing a larger check, and seeing how they go and build their own community. And as somebody who's built a bunch of communities, I end up actually consulting or, kind of sharing some lessons learned and following along the way to see how they've done it.
Can a founder ever build a community authentically if they have a hidden business agenda or not even hidden business agenda?
Community building is one of those things that
I'm asking this as a marketeer, because we're always thinking about community building from the perspective of marketing, user generation, growth, and like a growth lever, right? It is. It is a wonderful growth lever, but I think there's a big but there.
Yeah.
You can't force building a community.
Yeah, you can think about communities as like potentially on one dimension. Are they shallow or are they deep? And a lot of brand affiliation tends to be fairly shallow. And a lot of developer tools, if built properly, those communities end up being deep. And that they're deep because people spend their nights and weekends, contributing back or building something on top of that. Whereas usually like with consumer brands, people have a sticker or they, probably, or sometimes they, they maybe even buy stock if it's a publicly traded company. It's kind of like a more shallow, people vote with their money and they maybe...
It's a different type of affiliation.
It's a different type of affiliation, right? What I'm talking about here is kind of like active community where people actually donate the most valuable resource they have, which is their time.
So when it comes to brands, we're talking about like a network community where there's no layer of depositing value from the consumer. But
you vote with your money.
Or
exactly.
On the other side, you have this deep community where you deposit value quite often, obviously.
Correct.
And it's not affiliation based on the, image or
purely not just on that. Clearly there is some, but yeah.
Okay.
Those are harder to build. It isn't like a quick manual that you can read. And usually in order to build it, you need to have a really strong leader and a bunch of strong followers, right? Sometimes there isn't a single person who's leading it. Sometimes it's just like a bunch of strong followers. And building it in such a way, sometimes it's quite often, I think it's actually quite a bit of luck and persistence. But it's also just incredibly hard to do it because you're building something without a clear immediate ROI, and it takes time to build those types.
Your favorite type of problem.
Yeah, my favorite type of problem. Exactly. No, yeah, because if you end up succeeding in building it, there's a moat.
Yes.
Right, which is that somebody can't just go and replicate that deep trust that you established in the community, but you cannot set out just betting everything just on that. Like that's the other side of it, right? Like, it can be just like, we're gonna raise a bunch of money or do whatever, and we're gonna create this amazing networking community, and that's gonna be that. It's like, no, you actually have to solve some real problems along the way. You have to actually, right? Like there's this other stuff. So A, it's really difficult to build, and it's not a sure thing, and B, it's not enough. But if you solve other problems and you end up building a really deep community, you end up being a very formidable business.
Yeah. You mentioned building community as a moat, and it could be quite a strong one, but can't be unique. The only thing that you build on, right? I see open source.
Otherwise, you're just an open source project and another business.
Correct. So I see a lot of open source solutions
that's right.
and thriving community winning in that end of the world. But I also see now with AI and agentic future, a lot of thriving communities that started in an open source. We'll see there's a real business there. And I don't know, would you agree on that? Is this a community building in an age of AI and, agentic future, something that is quite a unique moat and a very strong one?
Yeah, I mean, arguably you could say that writing software or just pumping out code, 3 years ago, you could say like, well, good luck copying me because this is going to take you 10 engineers.
Forever.
10 engineers in 3 years and you're going to burn like $5 million to copy it. Now it's cheaper and easier and faster to build a replica than ever before.
The feature is not a competitive advantage.
So it's not a competitive advantage, right? Like moving fast is maybe an advantage, but so you'd have to think about one of the things as an investor that I look at is distribution, right? And then the other advantage I take a look at is access, right? And quite often, communities that form around open source end up giving you both. They end up giving you distribution to a bunch of people who want to bring that piece of software or bring that technology into their workplace, and it gives you access to decision makers and it gives you kind of like this defensive posture, because if you're seen as the best and the most trustworthy actor in a community, people will gravitate towards you, right? And in a place, in a universe where things are moving really, really fast and they coalesce around a source of gravity, point of gravity, I think we're going to see a really big acceleration. I'm currently looking at a couple of businesses that are only like, a year or two old, that have been built in open source communities that are themselves only a year or two old, that are just developing faster than anything I've ever seen before.
Yeah, you get that speed of movement with the open community that is constantly contributing. You don't have to hire 100 engineers. You get them on these platforms. It's pure magic when I look at it, and it's such a contrast to huge organizations like Microsoft, or they're really trying really, really hard to be.
Absolutely.
But Microsoft and organizations like that, they have a different mode. Like they
have distribution.
They sell.
They have distribution.
They have distribution.
I mean, think about it this way, right? Like if you are Microsoft or Google or Facebook, maybe a couple of other companies, you control the access point to internet.
Correct.
Apple, right? If people are trying to access internet, they're going to either use your device or your browser, or otherwise, Instagram, like pass through your authentication layer.
You're a gatekeeper anyhow.
So you have distribution, right? So like Apple changes something in their next iOS release, I don't know how many billion people use it, immediately is there. Google changes something, how their, Chrome browser works or how Google search works. Meta does the same thing around Instagram. It's 1 billion people overnight. So it's like that distribution layer. Like obviously we've never seen anything like that before. It's a huge advantage for such large companies, and in their case, like when they see something, and Meta especially has done this really, really well over time. When they see something working, they quickly copy it and use their distribution network to like launch a Me Too project that just like immediately has instant distribution. Or
they just buy you.
Well, sure. Sure.
When we talk about the moats and Microsoft, the big organizations like that, they're kind of gatekeepers to anything that's happening on the internet. What do you where do you stand on platform lock-in as a moat?
Sure.
And you created an open cap table. And for me, it's very fascinating that you put in the same room people that really don't want to talk to each other.
Absolutely.
And,
competitors.
Yes. Carta was there.
Yeah.
Well, Carta, Salesforce, they were all operating on a moat that is kind of platform lock-in.
Absolutely.
What's your stance on that one?
Well, Open Cap Table is one of multiple open source standards that I have launched over the career. And again, I look for these opportunities where a small group of people acting persistently over the period of time in a part-time fashion, but seeing something through can actually solve a much, much larger problem than like a small group of full-time people, right? It just takes time. And in this particular case, what ended up happening, and this is actually ultimately super ridiculous that this thing was allowed to happen. But when it comes to practicing startup law, it used to be a thing that people, by convention, ended up giving 4-year vesting periods for stock options, because at the time it took usually for a successful company about 4 years to go public.
Yeah.
Right. And so a bunch of convention was created in a world that no longer exists. And a bunch of this convention ended up being copied from one law firm to another law firm, but ended up never being standardized. And so you had language then when a law firm A represents a startup and a law firm B represents their investor, and they're looking at the underlying cap table documents, which is, employee share agreements, which is share purchase agreements, which is all, like 30 documents that usually exist that govern all of this: ownership rights, exercise rights, cap table stack, waterfall sequence, what happens upon certain events, and all of these things basically governs a big part of the corporate governance as well. You end up having these two law firms representing two different people at the table, interpreting the underlying document differently. Why? Because there were no standards. So law firm A interprets that language obviously the way their client wants. Law firm B interprets it to the benefit of their own client. Ends up being costly, ends up, in several cases where I was a consultant on the IPO process, end up delaying the IPO because people had to figure out the ownership rights, and there was arguments about how the certain things end up working. And so when you are a repeat founder like I was, and every single time you end up having the same issues, you're like, okay, there has to be a better way. So we created a free piece of software called CapTable.io, which ended up being used by close to 60,000 startups.
Wow.
Over time. It was the biggest software platform at the time, or startup platform at the time. And I ended up encountering all these issues, and I ended up then increasingly working with law firms until we all agreed it was such a big problem and causing so much friction in the fundraising or liquidation process or in the exercise process that eventually the pain of the non-standardization was big enough for the fiercest competitors. There's big 7 law firms in US that probably handle 90+% of all startups and VCs. They all came together, as well as the top 4 software platforms that handle cap tables came all together. A group of more than 30 members all together came together to create an open cap table standard. That is, an example where a standard that is open and agreed upon benefits all the participants, even the fierce competitors, if they can attract it, because the movement of data becomes simpler. And it's also an example of what I was talking about before, which is there's no business that should be built around that. It is something that should exist, and by the way, it's fully open source.
Yeah, it's open source.
It's a thing that should exist, and it's a thing that every startup in America and then more broadly should benefit from, and creates a better place for everybody, better environment for everybody.
Tiho, you mentor many founders, right? And what is the common thing you see founders get wrong when it comes to long-term, principle-focused building? Do they move their principle depending on the situation? Is that the right thing to do or not? Yeah. Or other things are coming afloat?
Probably the first mistake they do is select me as a mentor.
Good.
But seriously, I think one thing that is, I think, really important is to have multiple sources of advice.
Yeah.
And usually you shouldn't, unless for certain things which are important in marital relationships and familiar relationships, like listening to your parents and to your spouse. I think otherwise, when it comes to business, you should probably seek advice from multiple people and kind of find your own path. And a lot of times I see people, especially earlier on in their entrepreneurial journey, like quote back to me a piece of a book or a blog post that I wrote or somebody else wrote or something along those lines. And it's like, great, you're a great student, but like, you should also go and practice. The big thing again is I think I said this earlier today, but it's a contact sport. And so you got to practice it, and you can't just, blindly practice it. You have to have some sort of a feedback loop, right? So again, Lean Startup methodology teaches all about that. But, setting up a small learning step, reflecting, potentially course correcting after that, or persisting and saying like, what did I, until you have enough evidence to actually make a call as to how you should proceed. And so you can approach it quite formally when it comes to building a startup and entrepreneurial path. You can approach it quite haphazardly. I think probably, there's a dose of luck and being surrounded by the right people at the right time or being exposed to the right opportunities. But a lot of times it's just being persistent and seeing things through. To maybe answer your question a bit differently about what are some of the common mistakes I see people do is, or people make is, like in any relationship, most of the problems are created if you enter into the relationship and how you enter into the relationship, right? So not everybody should be your spouse, not everybody should be your business partner, not everybody, right? So like choosing initially really wisely, like who are you going to hire, who are you going to work with, like actually ends up being half the battle. And fundamentally as an entrepreneur, what you should be choosing first is the problem domain that you're working in. And people don't spend enough time, quite often this is the number one issue I see by far, is people don't spend time really understanding the problem domain they're in. And what do I mean by that? Some problems are worth solving, but you cannot build a business around it. I've built multiple communities, open cap table, PDF association, like all these things. Like I did not actually have a direct business interest in. It just happened to be a really good thing that indirectly I assume at some point is going to come back to me and going to give me business opportunities. But directly I'm not charging for it. I'm getting paid for it. It's a thing that just needs to exist. And a lot of times people are passionate about something they're doing, but they don't actually pause to think, can I build a really big and effective business solving this problem or working in this problem domain? What are my proxies? Like, are other people successful in this domain? Has anybody succeeded doing anything similar? What are the aspects of this problem domain? Like, does it lend itself to, bunch of small businesses coexisting? Or is it going to be a winner take all? All of these questions are really, really, really fundamental for an entrepreneur to ask. You can't know the answers right away. So you have to actually go and study, do customer interviews, conversations with investors, conversations with all the stakeholders, right? Maybe if you're not an engineer, talk to somebody who's technical and like, hey, can we actually solve this, right? And how expensive or how difficult is this to solve? So there's all these things they need to do. And a lot of people end up, I'm not going to say falling in love, but they end up going down a certain path and they kind of course commit. It's like kind of like a sunk cost fallacy. They keep persisting. And I have some really close friends of mine who like, whenever I see them, I'm like, you should quit.
Seriously?
Yeah, you should like not do this thing. It's really hard to admit that to yourself though.
It's extremely hard. And especially coming from you, and people know that you are a long time, someone that enjoys building things long time and solving problems in that particular bucket that you mentioned. And you commented you should give up. It actually, I would really think I should, if it comes from Tiho.
The inverse of that is people, the second most frequent problem I see is that people act like bees, and they spend very little time on a particular flower, and they get distracted by this other flower, and then they go there.
I met some of those people.
It's actually most entrepreneurs I know are like that, especially younger entrepreneurs, especially due to everything that's happening with, social media and AI and everything. It's like so quick. Like we're surrounded by these like seeming overnight successes. And if you just went there and just did that thing, you're going to be just as successful as that person on Instagram. That's the other thing I'm seeing quite a lot. And so that's the opposite problem, which is you don't spend enough time, or you get distracted by this other big thing. And so being an entrepreneur is like incredibly difficult. You have to be of two minds at all times. You have to feel this existential angst in your stomach, in the pit of your stomach, that you're doing something wrong. Mm-hmm. That like, what if I'm not making the right call? What if I'm wrong? What if that customer never actually ends up paying me? They're saying stuff, but they actually are not going to come through. Like, what are those things that are really bothering you? And then you have to lean into them. You can't be paralyzed by that. You have to lean into them, and you have to address those issues which are causing you angst. But you can't be, and you have to spend enough time on that to be like, hey, this is working and this isn't working. But you have to at the same time be, while you're having that anxious feeling, you have to be at the same time extremely hardworking and committed to actually seeing things through. So you have to be of two minds. You have to be fundamentally concerned that you're not going to make it. And at the same time being so committed that you are actually going to make it.
That's a very hard position to be in. I've been in it all my life, basically. Like, you need to have this sense of urgency, constant urgency, that you need to solve things, you need to move. And on the other hand, you cannot give up, you can't deplete yourself, and you need to believe in the project.
And then at some point, you actually have to be realistic. And that's where, friends or spouses, come in handy to be like, okay, you should kind of give up. This thing isn't working. Or investors can come in really handy and be like, hey, let's pivot, let's try something else, or let's just shut it down, Yeah,
you are the marital partner.
Yeah, you're, exactly.
Is there something you believe about how to build that the mainstream startup world would actually disagree with?
Yeah, I'm usually not that typical kind of contrarian investor or contrarian entrepreneur who looks for kind of what the herd is doing and then choosing the opposite or doing the opposite and seeing what the approach is. I tend not to be. I don't think I'm controversial in what I say or how I approach things. So I don't know if I have a good answer about it. I do think that a lot of people measure interim impact of their decisions, not the long-term impact of their decisions, because measuring things in the long run is much more difficult than measuring. Again, let's go back to the public markets. Your today's investment in March 2026 into R&D may not come about for 2, 3, 5 years, but whatever you do today is going to be reflected in, probably in Q2 earnings. And so much easier to measure things in the short run than to measure things in the long run. To measure things in the long run, you need to stay the course, you need to be conscious about what you want to measure, and to be able to reflect back in past and say and measure the metric. I find that in startups, a lot of people tend to be increasingly just human nature, quid pro quo, and short-term focused over the next couple of cycles. I tend to think about it the other way around. I think about like, who are the people I want to work with 10 years from today. I think I'm really close to investing in somebody who tried to recruit me as their CTO 12 years ago.
Wow.
And we stayed in touch. And I became a parent. He became a parent in the meantime. We like moved countries, did all these things, but we stayed in touch. And we reconnected recently over his new startup, which I think is going to change the world.
Wow.
And, I might be one of the very lucky few people who get to invest. And there's no way that I could have measured that 12 years ago when I said no to his CTO offer, right? And whatever fund I would have had at that point, or however you want to measure it, like would have expired. But I think it's one of those things that, like if you're guided by some very simple founding principles over the long run, I think things are gonna work out okay. They may not work out the best way. I may not be the best investor when it comes to returns on investment or what I earn from my LPs, but I think my way of working is different.
On that note, I would like to end this conversation and thank you from the bottom of my heart for taking this time to speak to me today and talk about this very, the topic is very close to me and the way I like to think about the world and operate. So, cheers to the next 20 years, Tiho, and let's see what is now going to bring into your life and into the
let's in 2036 let's have a follow-up podcast.
Let's talk a little bit earlier than that one, but thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.